1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 24. Chapter 7. Burkitt notes, our apostle, having finished the reprehensory part of this epistle in the foregoing chapters, he comes in this chapter to resolve diverse cases of conscience about which the Corinthians had written to him, particularly concerning marriage, not about the lawfulness of marriage, for that was out of dispute, but about the expediency of it at that time, whether it was advisable in that afflicted state of the church. Verse 1. Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Burkitt notes, the first scruple or case of conscience which the Corinthians wrote to the apostle about was concerning marriage, amongst many other wicked opinions, which the Gnostics, those ancient heretics, maintained, was this one, that marriage was from the devil. Our apostle elsewhere, Hebrews 13:4, asserts marriage to be holy and honorable. Here he determines first in general that such as has the gift of continency and can live chaste in a single state do well, and in particular that a single life at that time was most advisable and most agreeable to the calamitous and afflicted state of the church. So that when the apostle says in this verse, it's good for a man not to touch a woman, his meaning is, it's more agreeable to the present necessity, more convenient in regard of the persecuted state of the church, as being a condition less disturbed with cares and less troubled with distraction. For marriage plunges men into an excess of worldly cares. It multiplies their business, and usually their wants, and those wants are hardlier supplied than in a single life, and more difficulty borne. It is much easier to bear personal want than family wants, with respect to all which, says the apostle, especially as the present state of the church stands, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Not that it is at any time simply unlawful, but it's sometimes manifestly expedient. Verse 2. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. Burkitt notes, as if the apostle had said, such are the inclinations of human nature, that every man cannot always do that which is most for his own quiet and ease, but men find strength of lust and the power of concupiscence so strong in themselves that marriage, which is God's ordinance for avoiding fornication and for the propagation of mankind, is of absolute necessity to some persons. Therefore, for avoiding fornication and all sorts of uncleanness, which was so common at Corinth, let every man retain his own wife, and every woman her own husband. Here observe 1, the apostle's expression. He says, let every man and every woman marry, not some men and some women only. He accepts none, neither priest nor nun, but every one here is permitted, yea, for avoiding fornication, commanded to marry. Observe farther how the apostle directs every man to have his own wife, and every woman her own husband. More than one is forbidden, and polygamy, or the sin of having either more wives or more husbands at a time than one, is here condemned. To bridle and restrain men's extravagant lusts, the wisdom of God has directed every man to enjoy his own wife, and every woman her own husband. Let the Church of Rome consider how she will answer at the bar of God for spitting in the face of this ordinance of God, for denying the lawfulness of marriage to her priests and nuns, when God has told her, Hebrews 13:4, that marriage is honorable in all, and that all unclean persons God will judge. And such too often their priests and nuns have been with one another. Verses 3 through 5. Let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. The wife hath not power of her own body, but the husband. And likewise also, the husband hath not power of his own body, but the wife. Defraud ye not one the other, except it be with a consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your incontinency. Burkitt notes, observe here, 1, that matrimonial conversation, or the husband and wife's performing towards each other all the duties of marriage which they promised, as an act of justice which they owe to one another. This is intimated in the word render, and consequently to deny the same is injustice and fraud. defraud not one another. Marriage takes away from persons that power which they had over themselves and their own bodies, and transfers it in some sort to the person they're married to. Yet observe, too, that persons in a married state may, and in some cases ought, namely for religious ends and purposes, by mutual consent, to abstain from a conjugal duty for some time. Defraud not one another, except it be with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer. Observe 3. The Apostle lays no obligation upon any single persons to take upon them a vow for a single life, nor doth he direct married persons to those perpetual divorces from the marriage bed which the papists practice under the pretense of religion. For the Apostle admits of no perpetual separation between husband or wife upon any pretense whatever. No, not that they may give themselves to prayer and fasting, but only permits it for a time, upon condition that they come together again. So far was this holy man from laying a snare upon the consciences of any person, either in a single or married state. Verses 6 through 9. But I speak this by permission, and not of commandment. For I would that all men were even as myself. But every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, and another after that. I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it's good for them if they abide, even as I. But if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. Burkitt notes, as if the Apostle had said, mistake me not, as if I impose marriage upon all persons as a duty. No, but I declare it's permitted to all as a remedy against fornication. For so far am I from that I could wish all men were unmarried, even as I myself am, and that they had the gift of continence with myself. But God, who will have the world yet farther continued and increased, hath not given this gift to all, nor to all alike in the same measure. Therefore, to the unmarried I say, that so many are the advantages of a single life, that if they can abide chaste and single, as I do, it will be many ways for their advantage. But if they cannot, let them use God's remedy, which is marriage. For it's better to marry than to burn in lust, to be perpetually assaulted with unclean desires, and subject to the ravings and insults of lust. Learn hence, 1, that marrying and not marrying is according to several circumstances matter and advice of counsel, but neither of them absolutely of precept. 2, that second marriages are not only lawful, but an incumbent duty if persons cannot contain themselves within the bounds and rules of chastity. To the widows I say, if they cannot contain, let them marry. Verses 10 and 11. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. But, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. Burkitt notes, as if the Apostle had said, although it be no sin to marry, yet it is a sin to depart when married. Whereupon I lay the authority of God's command upon you, that you agree together, and that no difference which may arise between you cause you to separate and live asunder. But to marry upon departure is a double sin. Therefore, if any disagreement and discontents between husband and wife cause you to live asunder for a time, think not either of you marrying to another person, but be reconciled to each other and live together in love, as it becometh persons professing godliness. A civil war in families is fatal, as well as in the commonwealth. Domestic contentions, especially betwixt husband and wife, are dangerous and destructive of love and peace. If at any time they arise to that height as to cause separation between them two who are one flesh, yet nothing of that nature can warrant their divorce. Nothing but death or adultery can untie the marriage knot and release them from their obligation to each other. Verses 12 through 14. But to the rest I speak, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which has a husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now they are holy. Burkitt notes, 1. Here we have another case of conscience put by the Corinthians to the apostle, namely whether such husbands as had heathens and infidel wives might put them away, and whether such wives as had infidel husbands might not and ought not to depart from them. The apostle resolves the case that they ought, according to the intent and end of marriage, to cohabit and dwell together, and he assigns the reason for it, because the unbelieving or infidel wife is sanctified to the believing or Christian husband. How sanctified? Not in her nature, but in her use, so that they might lawfully cohabit and converse together, being by marriage made one flesh with him or her that is holy. And for our children, says he, they are not seminally unclean like the children of heathens, but federally holy. How are they holy? Not with an inherent internal personal holiness, for the holiest man's child is born in sin, and by nature a child of wrath, but with an external, relative, and federal holiness. They are not common and unclean like the children of infidels, but fit to be partakers of the privileges of the church, to be admitted into covenant with God, as belonging to his holy people. Else were your children unclean, but now they are holy. Observe, he doth not say, else were your children bastards, but now they are legitimate, as enemies of infant baptism, those hard children's parents, would make them speak. But else they were unclean, that is, heathen children not to be owned as holy seed, and therefore not to be admitted into covenant with God as belonging to his holy people. If by holiness here the apostle means a matrimonial holiness, as the Anabaptists dream, then according to their interpretation of the word holy, the apostle speaks neither pertinently nor truly. Not pertinently, 1, for then the answer had been nothing to the purpose. The case put was concerning husbands and wives, not concerning men and whores. And the question propounded by the Corinthians was not whether a believing husband and an unbelieving wife were lawful man and wife together. Nobody questioned that, but whether the Christian husband might put away his heathen wife. The apostle answers, he ought not, if she were willing to dwell with him, for she is sanctified to him. Not sanctified in respect of her personal condition, but in respect of her conjugal relation. Otherwise, their children would be looked upon as unclean, like the children of heathens. But now they were holy, that is, to be accounted visible saints, and as such, to be admitted to church privileges. 2. According to this interpretation of the word holy, the apostle had not spoken truly, for the children of heathens born in lawful wedlock are no more bastards than the children of Christians, for their parents' marriage frees them from the charge of illegitimacy as well as others. Add to this that in all the New Testament, though the word holy be used above 500 times, yet it never once signifies legitimacy, but is always used for a state of separation to God. Therefore, to make it signify so here is a bold practicing upon Scripture, a racking and wrestling of the Word of God, to maintain a private opinion, to make the text speak what they would have, and not what the apostle intends. But the argument for infant baptism from this text runs thus. If the holy seed among the Jews were therefore to be circumcised and made federally holy, by receiving the sign of the covenant and being admitted into the number of God's holy people, because they were seminally holy, for the root being holy, the branches were also holy. Then, by like reason, the holy seed of Christians ought to be admitted to baptism and receive the sign of the Christian covenant, the laver of regeneration, and so be entered into the society of the Christian church. Verses 15 through 17. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? But as God hath distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called every one, so let him walk. And so ordain I in all churches. Burkitt notes, here another doubt is resolved by the apostle. In case the unbelieving party, either husband or wife, depart, that is, refuse to cohabit and dwell with their believing yokefellow, and so make void, as much as in him or her lieth, the marriage bond, out of hatred to the faith. In that case, if they will go, let them. You are not bound to leave your family to follow them. However, let every Christian husband or wife omit nothing, but endeavoring everything to the utmost, to oblige and win, to incline and engage their unbelieving yokefellows, to live quietly with them. For God hath called us to peace, and therefore we must give no occasion of quarrel with or separation from so near a relation. And besides, by the peaceable dwelling together, there is hope of and a fair opportunity for the gaining and bringing over of the unbeliever to the faith of Christ, and of being the instrument of his or her salvation. But however that may be, let every Christian discharge his duty in every relation in which God has set him. This order I appoint in all churches to Christianity, knowing it to be agreeable to the mind of God, that no Christian could pretend his profession of religion to excuse him from the duties of any relation. Verses 18 and 19. Is any man called being circumcised? Let him not become uncircumcised. Is any called in uncircumcision? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing, but the keeping of the commandments of God. Burkitt notes, here the apostle proceeds to exhort the Corinthians to be content with the lot and condition which God had distributed unto them, and to frame themselves to walk Christianly in it. Particularly he shows that if any person among them were a native Jew, and so circumcised, and afterwards converted to Christianity, he should neither trouble himself to get off that mark from his flesh, nor affect the state of him who, being a Gentile, had never been circumcised. On the other side, if any of them were native Gentiles, and were never circumcised, but now converted to Christianity, let him not affect the state of one who was a native Jew, and circumcised. For circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. That is, nothing now available to salvation, nothing that renders persons more or less acceptable in the sight of God. But the keeping of the commandments of God, this is all in all. For God regards not men's outward conditions, but obedience to his commands. Christianity consists not in a warm zeal, either for or against outward ceremonies, but in a positive holiness and a strict conformity to divine precepts. Verses 20 through 24. Let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called. Art thou called being a servant? Care not for it. But if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. For he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's freeman. Likewise also he that is called being free is Christ's servant. Ye are bought with a price. Be not ye the servants of men. Brethren, let every man, wherein he is called, therein abide with God. Burkitt notes, the apostle seems to intimate from these words that some persons converted to Christianity in the primitive times apprehended that thereupon they must leave their worldly calling and employments, as if they were snares to them, or unnecessary diversions from better things. No, says the apostle, let everyone in his calling, wherein he is called, thereby abideth with God. That is, look in what honest civil calling they were found in when they became Christians. Let them keep to that calling still. For God doth not call us from our worldly employments and business, but calls us to be wholly in them. Nor doth our serving God any whit acquit or discharge us from serving one another. But particularly it was the opinion of some servants converted to Christianity that their spiritual freedom by Christ exempted them from all civil service to their masters. The apostle therefore tells them they are indeed freed by Christ from sinful slavery, but not from civil servitude and subjection, from Jewish bondage, but not from Christian obedience. Learn hence that Christianity doth not free men from any civil obligation which before they lay under. Our advantages by Christ are spiritual, and not secular. No man's outward condition is changed by his becoming a Christian. Though he will now be the Lord's freeman, yet he is a servant still, if he was so before. Nay, their Christianity did not exempt them from their secular relation to their heathen and infidel masters. A service to man doth not exempt us from, nor is inconsistent with, the service of God. Our spiritual calling doth not make void our civil. Therefore let every man abide in the same calling wherein he was called.